Since becoming president of the Philippines in 2016, Rodrigo Duterte has fought his so-called war on drugs. While many have criticised him, including the International Criminal Court, who recently said there was a reasonable basis to believe that crimes against humanity have been committed, the president has said that he will continue with this campaign until the day he leaves office. Today I'll be speaking with Regine Cabato, a Washington Post reporter in Manila, about the current situation in the Philippines with the war on drugs and how it has balanced this with the coronavirus pandemic. Hi Regine, thank you so much for joining us today. Could you tell us a bit about the work that you do at the Washington Post?
Hi Laura, thanks for having me on the show. I'm the Philippines-based reporter for the Washington Post. I've been working with the Post for around 3 years now. And we've done a lot of reports about basically the major current events coming out of, and that includes politics, that includes the drug war, human rights concerns in the region, as well as other issues such as typhoons and the regular news, basically.
I wanted to touch on the coronavirus pandemic briefly. What is the current situation like in the Philippines regarding the pandemic, and how would you say the government has handled the coronavirus situation overall?
As I'm sure you've heard, Laura, the Philippines has had one of the longest and harshest lockdowns in the world. And lockdown in the Philippines has even surpassed the lockdown in Wuhan, where the pandemic first began. We have the second highest infection rate in Southeast Asia, and we are one of the last countries in the region, if not the last, to procure vaccines. We have currently over 500,000 cases and counting of COVID-19. Healthcare workers have yet to be vaccinated, and the first shipment, after a certain amount of delay, is expected to arrive around next week or next month in March. However, despite all of this, as you may have seen in our January report, while regular Filipinos have to wait and buy time until the vaccines arrive, there has been a thriving black market for vaccines in the Philippines as well. And we've heard of public officials, including a special envoy to China and Duterte's presidential security team, who have openly admitted on national television to already taking or to already being inoculated with smuggled vaccines. So this is more or less what the COVID situation is like in the Philippines currently. There's a lot of uncertainty, although a lot of people, when you walk out on the street, it kind of gives you a feel like there is a sense of normalcy, in the sense that people are out, traffic is back up again, people still go to malls, but there is still an undercurrent to all of that, the undercurrent of uncertainty as to when things will really go back to normal.
So picking up on that uncertainty, paying particular attention to the drugs war going on, is there any similarities in the way that the government has handled the pandemic with the way it's handled the war on drugs?
For sure, Laura. And this is something that we wrote about last year in around July. There have definitely been parallels. When lockdown was first declared in March last year, the first state of quote-unquote enhanced community quarantine, which is basically the government's terminology for a strict lockdown, was given just less than 6 hours before it was meant to be implemented. And a lot of people were stranded on the road, inconvenienced a lot of commuters. A lot of people were very uncertain of what it meant to be under lockdown and what that entailed. And in the coming weeks and in the coming days, we saw a lot of arrests for quarantine violators. People who basically just unaware, or sometimes, just outside of their house, who have suddenly been picked up and arrested or what have you. And sometimes these arrests have been counterintuitive to pandemic health protocol, because a lot of detainees were suddenly put together in cramped and crowded cells. We've also noticed in the weeks that followed in the past year that a number of quarantine violators have been subject to various forms of public humiliation, even torture, there have been cases, as noted by human rights watchdogs and this seen on social media, of people being left out in the heat of the sun, of people being placed inside the dog cage, of being placed inside the coffin. And there has been at least one case of a certain quarantine violator caught on video, caught on camera, being shot point blank by police. And this was a very controversial case last year because the victim turned out to be a former soldier who was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. So he was mentally unwell. And he wasn't really in a situation to be processing what was happening to him. And you could hear people in the video screaming in the background, asking police why they didn't exercise maximum tolerance. So that's more or less what the human rights concerns in the Philippines has been like for the past year. Another similarity with the drug war is that these goings on, these events, and these restrictions have disproportionately affected and targeted the poor. While we've seen cases of, like I've said, the poor being placed inside dog cages or being detained, possibly unlawfully, we've also seen cases of the rich and famous in the Philippines explicitly violating quarantine protocol, and they just get away with a slap on the wrist. So according to analysts that we've spoken to, experts that we've spoken to, there seems to be a very hyper-masculine approach that the government has tried to deploy into this health problem. As one expert, Iris Arugay, put it, he called this particular methodology of government a one-trick pony. They're basically trying to use one policy model, the drug war, and kind of trying to employ similar techniques that were used in it for a different issue altogether. This time around, for the pandemic.
Do you think that the pandemic has increased these social inequalities and human rights abuses, or is this something that has just continued and remained stable, but it's just more visible now through the pandemic?
It's a bit of both. At the beginning, the pandemic is definitely kind of really revealed a lot of the inequalities, the social inequalities, the problems in the healthcare system, the problems in the socioeconomic system, all the unsustainable things that were already present in Philippine society. A lot of that became exacerbated because of the pandemic. Yeah, we've seen it because a lot of people have lost jobs during the pandemic. There's been record unemployment. There's been record poverty, according to statistics. So it's been a very difficult time all around for Filipinos.
And on an international level, President Duterte has been criticized by the UN, the ICC, and as you mentioned, the Human Rights Watch.
Mm-hmm.
What is the view domestically of the president and his policies?
Okay. Before I jump into answering that question, Laura, maybe a bit of overview as well as to how the drug war has continued even amid the pandemic. So earlier I mentioned that there's been an exposure and continued concerns regarding already present socioeconomic inequalities. But there's also been, I think it's important to note that outside of quarantine violation concerns, there has been continued police abuse under the drug war itself. According to Human Rights Watch, let me just pull up the figure. Drug war killings in the Philippines increased by more than 50% during the early months of the pandemic. There have been continued killings, basically, and lockdown has not hampered police abuse. And in fact, evidence, points to the contrary. So just this month, for example, a contact that we have at a Manila slum told us that there were around 3 killings the week before we met her at a community that she monitored. And she even showed us a grainy photo that she had taken of a body hanging under a bridge. Another contact that I have, a local priest, told me that he recently buried a guy who had a smiley face engraved on his chest. So I'm sorry to be like very graphic about these particular details because they're gruesome and they're quite disturbing, but it kind of points to a picture of how the pandemic has not deterred the culture of impunity that continues to take place in the Philippines. It's kind of hard to say how much of this or what fraction of the killings, are from police operations and how much more come from vigilante killings or from masked men, which there is still a lot of. But generally, all of this falls under a larger culture of impunity. And in the course of quarantine, there has been not just one, but at least 2 police killings that were brutally caught on video. One police killing was the one I mentioned earlier of a former soldier. And there was another one more recently of a mother and son who was shot point blank. And they were both shot twice in the head by a policeman who lost his temper. So these very disturbing videos, these very disturbing accounts point to a picture of what life is like here so far. And recently, moving on to your question about international organizations, the Justice Department has admitted in a recent UNHCR meeting that there has been a failure on the part of law enforcement to follow standard protocols in its operations. They openly admitted that there has been lapses in their process, that oftentimes police did not properly report about the weapons that they found in the scene or stuff like that. And the Justice Department maintained, and this hopefully answers your question on the view domestically of Duterte and his allies. The Justice Department maintained that, because it was able to find these lapses, then the justice system internally is working. It will launch an internal investigation into this matter. It will hold people who are irresponsible to account, etc., etc. This particular admission from the DOJ is important because it's the first of its kind that we've heard from the allies of Duterte. For the most part, a lot of people in the ranks of government and even the president himself has openly blamed victims for basically firing first or shooting at policemen first, and that's why they end up being killed. And Duterte has on many occasions, encouraged the outright killing of drug suspects. So basically, Duterte and those under him maintain that these domestic mechanisms, the courts and the local means of redress, are available and fully functional. But these observations that were reported by the DOJ is not news to Human Rights Watchdog, and it's not news to the media who have long been observing this and who have already found through research, through accounts, through word in the street that police have routinely planted evidence against victims. Some observers speculate that the DOJ's recent admission may be a move to escape international scrutiny, as the government can now argue that it's capable of solving the issue because it found these internal errors. But human rights orgs do not trust that the government will be able to fulfill this. The Philippines has a very clogged justice system, and government practices here are riddled with red tape and with corruption. According to one ABS-CBN report that's from a local broadcaster here, out of over 4,000 investigations under the PNP's or under the Philippine National Police's Internal Affairs Office between 2016 and 2019, there is only one case that saw the light of court, or there is only one case that ended in a conviction, rather. And that is the high-profile case of the 17-year-old Kian de los Santos in 2017, because there was closed-circuit or CCTV footage that sparked public outrage regarding this case. So far, we've also seen similar public outrage for the last 2 cases that have been caught on video. The case of the former soldier who was killed after being accused of violating quarantine, and the case of the case of the mother and son that I mentioned earlier. So there might be also a bit of progress on these cases because the evidence is quite clear. It was on the media for quite a long time, and public outrage was very imminent. However, this is not the case for all the thousands of other cases in the drug war that have been taking place. So many other cases, including cases that we've monitored, have gone cold. And a lot of families are very scared to come forward and to report their case. So that's the reality on the ground. And it will be very difficult, it seems, for the DOJ to be able to trace each one of these cases.
Absolutely. And on top of that, Duterte has been very vocal with his protection for the police. And with elections coming up in 2022, do you feel that this police behaviour will persist once he leaves office? Is it linked to government leadership, or is this now inherent in the police itself, this kind of behaviour?
That's a very good question. It's quite difficult to tell because the culture of impunity in the Philippines has been around long before Duterte. And analysts and activists, people who have long been immersed in the scene here, would probably say that it will be around long after Duterte is gone. So one of the things that has taken place in recent years with Duterte's rise to power is a kind of emboldening of this kind of culture, this hyper-masculine culture, and a culture that was long present in the South, where Duterte is from, in Davao City. We've heard of, like assassinations or anecdotes of assassinations and killings like this quite frequently. But when Duterte came to power, that kind of model was kind of taken to a bit of a nationwide scale. So it will take more than just one election to correct or to undo this kind of culture, which historically probably has been around for quite a long time. It will also largely depend on who is going to run and who is going to win in the 2022 presidential elections. But at this point, it's too early to speculate because we have no idea who is going to be making a bid for power at that time.
And just finally, as a journalist, can you see any accountability mechanisms? And during this pandemic, has freedom of speech been affected at all?
Definitely. I have a colleague in the Foreign Correspondents Press Club of the Philippines, my counterpart in the New York Times, Jason Gutierrez, who has said something along these lines. Freedom of speech has always been under attack in the Philippines, but the degree to which it has been endangered has worsened in the recent years. The Philippines has always consistently ranked among the world's worst places for journalists. If you remember, we were the subject of global headlines back in 2009 because of the massacre of some 30-something media workers. That was a very brutal event, and it took around 10 years before any justice was served for the families of those victims. That's been a recent win for journalists locally, but there have been a lot more losses for press freedom in recent years. And there are two main fronts for the suppression of freedom of speech that I've personally observed as a reporter based here. The first is attacks on the business aspect of journalism, and the second is the censorship of content. So in the first aspect, on the business side of things, we've seen a lot of local regional papers fold due to the pandemic. So that's not necessarily, a government-induced or a suppression or induced factor, but a lot of publications have struggled economically, especially under lockdown. But there have also been cases of the government outright questioning the business model that certain news outlets have. One newsroom, Rappler, most known for its high-profile CEO, Maria Ressa, has been accused of foreign ownership. Maria and Rappler, as a newsroom, is facing a slew of various cases in court. And locally, perhaps the most impactful and the biggest attack on the business has been the closure of the media giant ABS-CBN, which is a broadcaster that reaches millions of people across the country. This closure, which came after the Congress did not renew the franchise of the network, affected some 11,000 employees, and it shut down several bureaus from across the region, and it effectively crippled a lot of the news industry, especially in places, for example, that are far flung, that are hit by typhoons, where ABS-CBN has been, the only source of accessible information. So that's on the first aspect, on the business aspect. On the second, there's, in terms of content and in terms of censorship, Maria Ressa and another Raptor journalist have been convicted for cyber libel. And more reporters from across the country face similar charges. So libel is still a crime in the Philippines. And we've seen newspapers take down or retract old stories in the face of threats from businessmen or politicians. Self-censorship in local newsrooms is also a common problem. And on top of all this, killings against journalists continue, as does online harassment and threats, as does being trolled. And yeah, it's been quite difficult. The pandemic and the necessity of remote press conferences have made it increasingly difficult for journalists to personally engage with government officials and to ask difficult questions, to seek accountability. Just yesterday, reporters called out presidential spokesman Harry Roque for cutting off journalists as they asked questions. Roque has lashed out at journalists before, most recently 2 female journalists from CNN Philippines. And reporters seem to have experienced their audio being muted during these, press cons. And from observation, the questions are often fielded through a government staffer, giving people from government who answer the questions leeway to be as curt or as terse as possible because the press is unable to field their follow-up questions. So many journalists recently have experienced also being, gaslit or belittled by government officials for doing their job. So that's generally what the atmosphere is like for the press in the Philippines. Yes, people can still publish online, do their job for the most part, but that doesn't mean that it's not getting increasingly difficult to do this job.
Thank you so much. That was a really insightful conversation with Regine, and I'd like to thank her enormously for her time